G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the second series of the History in the Bible podcast. More of the history in more of the books in all the Bibles. Episode 2.59, The Fates of the Apostles. In the last episode, I followed Paul to his fate. Paul never met Jesus in the flesh. But what happened to those who did? The 12 disciples and James the Just. In most cases, the answer is simple. The New Testament is silent, and we only have stories made up decades or centuries later. The book of Acts, for example, recounts that the disciples chose 7 deacons to wait on tables, while they were engaged in more important things, like praying. Of those 7, the New Testament only tells us the fate of Stephen in one of the great set pieces in Acts. For more on that, rewind to my episode 2.50, the first Jesus Club 2, Tribulations. Let's start with Peter, prince of the disciples. He was one of the inner cabinet of 3, along with the 2 sons of Zebedee, John and James. We last saw Peter at the Council of Jerusalem 6 episodes ago, and a little more than halfway through the book of Acts. Peter disappears from the book after this surprise guest appearance. The only allusion to Peter's death in the New Testament is in the final chapter of the Gospel of John. Some scholars think this is an addition to the original Gospel. Be that as it may, Jesus tells Peter that the disciple is doomed to a martyr's death. Quote, John 21:18. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go. He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. End quote. In the last episode, I mentioned Clement, traditionally held to be an early bishop of Rome. In his first letter, Clement said that Paul had travelled to Spain. Clement in his first letter also has something to say about Peter, brief as it is. Quote, 1 Clement 5:4. Because of unjust jealousy, Peter bore up under hardships, not just once or twice, but many times. And having thus borne his witness, he went to the place of glory that he deserved. End quote. Our earliest sources imply that Peter died a martyr. None of them give a clue as to where and when. That information can only be found in a work of fan fiction, the Acts of Peter. This was written at least a century after Peter's death. From the numerous fragments we have in many languages, the Acts of Peter was a bestseller. The book recounts what no other source does: Peter's later career and martyrdom in Rome during Nero's persecution. Peter is summoned from Jerusalem to Rome by emissaries from the Eternal City. The evil Simon Magus is running amok, seducing good Christians from the path with his magical miracles. We last met Simon in good old episode 2.50, the first Jesus Club Tribulations, where Simon tried to buy his way into Peter's good graces. Only one man can save the Roman community: Peter the Judean. Peter and Simon engage in a protracted, wonder-working face-off. Simon is at first reluctant to challenge Peter. Peter shames him into a confrontation. Peter sends a talking dog and a precociously loquacious baby to cajole the cowardly Simon from his hidey hole. Rather than throw thunderbolts, they hurl miracles at each other. They both raise from the dead. Simon flies above the crowd, but Peter triumphs. Long quote. Acts of Peter 32. Simon beheld Peter and said, Peter, I am going to fly before all this people that see me. For I, ascending up, will show myself to all this multitude who I am. When he was lifted up on high, and all saw him raised up above all Rome, and the temples and the mountains, the faithful looked toward Peter. And Peter, seeing the strangeness of the sight, cried to the Lord Jesus Christ, If you let this man accomplish that which he has set about, all the signs and wonders which you have given them through me will not be believed. O hasten your grace, O Lord, and let him fall from the height and be disabled. And let him not die, but be brought to naught, and break his leg in 3 places. And Simon fell from the height, and broke his leg in 3 places. Then every man cast stones at Simon, and went away home, and believed Peter. End quote. I just love the way that Peter prays to Jesus. Don't kill Simon, just maim him. And when the mob stones Simon to death, Peter departs with a clear conscience, knowing that he did not execute Simon, the crowd did. The book concludes with Peter's martyrdom. As the story goes, Peter has persuaded the wives and concubines of 2 high-ranking Roman magistrates into celibacy. That's a classic Paul push, not a Peter ploy. The good Jew Peter would never enjoin celibacy on a woman. Let's just let that pass. The sexually frustrated officials come after Peter with murder in their hearts. As Peter is hightailing it out of the city, he is met by Jesus coming the other way. Where are you going? Asks a startled Peter. Jesus replies that he is travelling to Rome to be crucified again. Thus shamed, Peter returns to Rome and a martyr's death. That originally Greek sentence from the Acts of Peter was rendered as the Latin Quo Vadis in the popular Polish novel of the same name, written in the late 19th century. It later became the title of several extravagant movies. Peter is crucified on a cross, upside down by his own wish. The usual gloss on this is that Peter felt he was unworthy to die in the same way as his master. But that is not the reason that Peter gives. Peter declaims that our values are upside down. To make his point, he insists on an inverted crucifixion. We need to look beyond the appearances of this world and its inverted values, and adopt the values of Christ. The book of the Acts of Peter cemented in tradition that Peter, like Paul, met his fate in Rome, martyred under the Emperor Nero. But outside of that book, we have no evidence that Peter ever stepped foot in Rome. A vociferous minority of scholars argue that the Church continued to reconcile the irreconcilable, making Peter and Paul look like each other. Our book of Acts taught that Paul travelled to Rome. So, the Acts of Peter decided the same about its hero. Quite a lot of books and letters attributed to Peter circulated in the century after Jesus' death. Only 2 made it into the New Testament. Of these, only one can credibly be attributed to the disciple, the letter of 1 Peter. 1 Peter contains one of the very few New Testament references to the vast literature of the Second Temple period. In this passage, the letter quotes from the first book of Enoch with its stories of imprisoned angels. Quote, 1 Peter 3:18. For Christ was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which also he went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison, who in former times did not obey, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah, during the building of the ark. End quote. For more on jolly old 1st Enoch, why not rewind to episode 2.9, The Apocalypse to End Them All, 1st Enoch. A sizable minority of scholars hold to the traditional view that the disciple Simon Peter was indeed the author of the first letter of Peter. The author says it right there in the very first verse. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the exiles of the dispersion. If so, this letter would be the earliest document in the New Testament after the letters of Paul. Yet the first letter of Peter was only reluctantly accepted by the church fathers as authentic. The fathers were discomforted that the author never mentions himself as Jesus' best mate. Why doesn't the author name-drop Jesus at every turn? Oh, and as I said to my best friend, the Son of God and Messiah, after a few wineskins, nor does the author recount one single story or saying from Jesus' life. Even when you would expect the author to quote Jesus, he does not. Take this famous teaching of Jesus. Quote, Luke 6:27. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. Give to everyone who begs from you. Do to others as you would have them do to you. End quote. The author of 1 Peter makes that very point, but he does not quote Jesus. Instead, he quotes Psalm 34. Quote, 1 Peter 3:9. Do not repay evil for evil, or abuse for abuse, but on the contrary, repay with a blessing. It is for this that you were called, that you might inherit a blessing. For those who desire life and desire to see good days, let them keep their tongues from evil. Let them turn away from evil and do good. Let them seek peace and pursue it, for the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous. End quote. While most modern scholars agree with the fathers that Peter himself did not write the letter, they do believe that it is one of the earlier of the New Testament books, perhaps written a little earlier than the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. That is still decades after the death of Peter in the early 60s. The first letter of Peter adopts the form of Paul's letters. It uses many phrases and concepts from the Pauline letters, such as Paul's typical greeting, grace and peace be yours. Paul really should have copyrighted that motto. The letter strives to make Peter look like Paul. Whoever wrote it, and whenever it was written, the letter was directed to oppressed Jesus followers in Asia Minor, modern Turkey. The traditional interpretation ascribes this oppression to those universal villains, the Romans. Most scholars now believe that 1 Peter describes Jesus' followers who were attacked by their local communities. Nothing to do with imperial authority. If we have our dates right, then this letter shows us that around the year 80, members of a religious minority were harassed by their own neighbours. Thank goodness nothing like that happens today. This letter instructs its readers to stay below the radar. Don't make a fuss. Just go about your business. Quote, 1 Peter 2:13. For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of the emperor or of governors. For it is God's will that by doing right you should silence the ignorance of the foolish. As servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. Fear God. Honour the emperor. End quote. This letter is one of quiet courage and hope. For centuries, 1 Peter has comforted oppressed Christians. Most of the other 12 disciples have hardly any speaking lines in the Gospels, and none in the book of Acts. They should have hired better agents. John the son of Zebedee was one of the inner cabinet of 3, the beloved disciple. The Gospel of John revels in the beloved disciple's rivalry with Peter. Later tradition held that John wrote the Gospel of that name, 3 letters and Revelation. I'll cover all those in Season 3. The disciple John's career after the death of Jesus is obscure. Paul mentions him in passing as one of the pillars of the church, along with Peter and James, brother of Jesus. The book of Acts recounts that he was thrown into prison with Peter. It was said that John took Jesus' mother Mary into his care. Many decided he lived until his 90s in Ephesus in Asia Minor. Others said that he died in Antioch or the island of Patmos. The earliest church fathers were in no doubt that John was the longest lived and last of the disciples. Many second-generation fathers claimed him as their teacher. That boast was never made about any of the other disciples. The fate of John's brother, James, 3rd member of the inner cabinet, is starkly described in Acts. That book records that James was the first disciple to be martyred. He was executed by Herod Agrippa around the year 42, about a decade after the death of Jesus. That would have been in the early years of Paul's mission. Paul often mentions a James in his letters, but it's not this James. When Paul refers to James in his letters, he means James, the brother or cousin or relative or whatever of Jesus. Apart from James the brother of Jesus and James the son of Zebedee, the New Testament mentions a disciple called James the son of Alphaeus. His sole function seems to be to round out the number of disciples to 12. Scant legend decided that James son of Alphaeus died in Persia by crucifixion. The Gospel of Mark tosses in a reference to yet another James, the son of one Mary. No, not that Mary, and no, not the other Mary. This James became known as James the Younger, or James the Lesser. The church spent a good few centuries entangling, and then disentangling, and then re-entangling all these people called James. Again, go back to episode 2.50, the First Jesus Club, Tribulations, for more on all these Jameses. Judas Iscariot shares his name with another disciple. This other Judas is given one single line in the Gospels, and that at the Last Supper. The Gospel of John calls him Judas, not Iscariot, just to be oh so clear. Luke calls him Judas, son of yet another James. The Gospels of Mark and Matthew were so embarrassed that they renamed him Thaddeus. The stigma against the name Judas passed down in English and French usage. Today, Judas Thaddeus is known in those languages as Jude. Some church fathers believe that this disciple wrote the letter of the same name. The letter of Jude is a tiny 25 verses long. According to the Bible aggregation site BibleGateway.com, The letter is one of the least popular books in the New Testament, alongside the last two letters of John and the letter to Philemon. The author, whoever he is, rants against Christians whom he believes are doing it wrong, with all their communal love feasts. The letter is most notable for quoting directly from our old friend, the first book of Enoch. Many church fathers were not happy with that, as they were with 1 Peter. The letter struggled to find a place in the canon, and was only grudgingly confirmed after 2 centuries of dispute. Later traditions fabricated a feeble history about Judas Thaddeus. He preached throughout the Middle East and was martyred in the Roman province of Syria at about the same time as the Apostle Peter died in Rome. Let's move on to 3 disciples often associated with each other: Andrew, Philip, and Bartholomew. Andrew was the brother of Peter. As the little brother of the biggest of the big 3, you would think that Andrew would get significant airtime. Alas, no. Andrew and his best mate Philip put the bit into bit player. It was said that Andrew was martyred in Greece. For obscure reasons, he became the patron saint of countries as diverse as Ukraine, Scotland, and Romania. Andrew's mate, the disciple Philip, is a rather sad figure. Philip only has 2 friends, Andrew and the disciple Bartholomew. The Gospel of John calls him Nathanael. Later stories held that Philip and Bartholomew preached in Greece and the Middle East. Yet others told of Bartholomew preaching in Armenia and India. Bartholomew is the patron saint of the Armenian Apostolic Church. Both apostles, it was said, were martyred. Christians couldn't decide on the particulars of Bartholomew's grisly death. One account speaks of his being kidnapped, beaten unconscious, and cast into the sea to drown. Another states that, like his brother, he was crucified upside down. Another says he was skinned alive and beheaded. So many ways to die. The disciple Matthew pops up a tiny 5 times in the New Testament. After his call, Matthew evaporates. He makes a brief cameo in the book of Acts, where he is present when the disciples choose a replacement for Judas Iscariot. The church fathers decided that this disciple Matthew wrote the gospel of that name. That would make him an eyewitness to the events he narrates, and his gospel the earliest. Neither Mark nor Luke claim to be witnesses to the mission of Jesus. Speculations about Matthew's later history were legion. Perhaps he proselytized in Ethiopia, or in Persia, or Macedonia, or Scythia. Some church fathers believed he died a natural death. Others thought he died by order of the Jewish authorities. The lengthiest story was told in the book The Acts of Matthew. Compared to other book of Acts attributed to the disciples, this book was written very late, just before the dissolution of the Western Empire. In this romance, Matthew converts a country of cannibals and peacefully passes away after his mission is accomplished. Matthew has 1 gospel under his belt and 1 collection of Acts. The disciple Thomas had rather more books attributed to him. I'll cover them in Season 3. Thomas was said to have founded a Christian community in Parthia and India, where he is regarded as a patron saint. Stories held that he was martyred in India. Now, the final disciple. Simon the Zealot, also known as Simon the Canaanian, only appears as a name in a list. No one ever bothered to write a book under his name. There is no Acts of Simon the Zealot, no Gospel of Simon the Zealot. Later Christians invented a few half-hearted stories about his later career. Perhaps he evangelized in Egypt and Persia with his underachieving comrade Judas Thaddeus. Some authors said he was martyred, others that he died of old age. No one really knew, and no one really cared. Poor Simon. Let me wrap up this episode with the story of James the Just, brother or cousin of Jesus. James was an apostle, but not a disciple. Disciple is a translation of the Greek word for student. Apostle is a translation of ambassador. Jesus had precisely 12 disciples, all of whom became apostles, with one notable exception, of course. James and Paul were apostles, but never disciples. Indeed, the evidence in the Gospels is that James was deeply embarrassed by Jesus. James appears in a major subplot in the book of Acts as a boss of the Jerusalem Club. Paul describes James in his letters as a frenemy. Later generations of Christians remembered James only as a third-billed player in a cosmic drama starring Jesus as the Son of God and co-starring Peter and Paul. At least James was granted the dignity of sanctity. Some very early church fathers described him as a Nazarite. He prayed so often in the temple that he deformed his knees. The Roman Jewish historian Josephus held James in the same esteem as he did John the Baptist. Josephus records that the high priest Ananus unjustly and illegally had James stoned to death in the year 62. That's around the time the tradition holds that Paul was martyred in Rome. Later church fathers believe that the Jews threw James from the pinnacle of the temple. His broken but not yet dead body was clubbed to death. The name of James is attached to a single letter in the New Testament. The author doesn't claim to be James the Just. A few argued he was written by the disciple James the son of Zebedee. For more on that James, have a listen to episode 2.40, Jesus' Disciples, the Cabinet of Three. Most contended that the author was indeed James the Just, relative of Jesus. We hear no more about the letter until some Western church fathers cited it 200 years after the death of Jesus. Eastern church fathers were still undecided 300 years after the death of Jesus. The letter of James barely made it into the canon. Martin Luther wanted to toss the book out wholesale. Why this reluctance to accept the letter of James? Because if you ditch just 2 small verses in this short book of 5 chapters, the letter reads like a sermon in a synagogue. More than that, the author writes against Paul to defend the basic Jewish idea that to follow the law is to be righteous. James denounces Paul's idea that following the law is futile and only faith is required. James argues they are the same. In this passage, James uses Paul's expression works, shorthand for works of the law. Quote, James 2:18. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I by my works will show you my faith. Do you want to be shown, you senseless person, that faith apart from works is barren? Was not our ancestor Abraham justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was brought to completion by the works. And for just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead. End quote. In the next and final episode of this season, I give credit where credit is due, and lay out my plans for my third and final season. Thanks for listening. For maps, charts, and diagrams, check out my website, www.historyinthebible.com.